But even as I said the words, something in my gut told me that things were far worse than any of us had imagined. What if we weren't ready for what she'd see? What if none of us were? We couldn't take our eyes off the freezer, but I was the one who had to break the news. I rushed out of the house, my heart pounding in my chest. Every step I took felt like 1,000 miles. Auntie Joy had to be told, but I couldn't bear to see the horror in her eyes. How could I? How could anyone tell a mother something like this? I barely made it past the first few houses before I saw Reverend Father and another neighbor, Obi, rushing toward me. They'd heard the commotion and rushed over. They looked like they already knew something was wrong, but they had no idea just how wrong it was. "What happened?" Reverend Father asked, his voice taut with anxiety. I stammered out the details, barely able to speak. The kids were gone. We found them. I couldn't even finish the sentence, and the look on their faces said everything. They'd already heard the whispers. The rumors had spread fast through the compound. The police had been called. We rushed back to the house, all of us on edge. The air felt oppressive now, and the house seemed to hold its breath with every step we took. When we reached the kitchen, the officers were already there. But there was something unsettling about their behavior. They didn't approach the freezer. They didn't even look at it. Instead, they stood in the corners of the room, whispering to one another in hushed tones, as if they were avoiding something they couldn't face. Auntie Joy appeared in the doorway, her face a picture of exhaustion and fear. Her eyes darted around the room, finally settling on us. Her voice was low but steady. "Where are they? Where are my children?" Nobody answered. "What's in there?" she asked, her voice rising, eyes flicking to the freezer. She took a step forward, but an officer blocked her path. "Ma'am, please," one of the officers said. His voice was shaky, but he tried to sound authoritative. "We're still trying to assess the situation. It's better if you wait outside." But Auntie Joy wasn't going to wait. She wasn't going to stand there while her children were treated like this. "No," she said firmly. "They're my children. I have the right to see them. No matter what you've found, I have the right." Her words hit the room like a thunderclap, and for a moment no one moved. The officers exchanged glances, and I could feel the tension in the air. Auntie Joy wasn't backing down, neither were the officers. But she was their mother. The room grew colder as she stepped closer to the freezer, demanding to know the truth. The officer who had been blocking her suddenly moved aside. I could see the fear in his eyes. He didn't want her to see, but he didn't have a choice. The room seemed to shrink around us as the officer slowly moved the lid of the freezer. But before he could open it fully, there was a loud noise, a thump, a low, heavy thud from inside. It sent a chill down my spine. Everyone in the room froze. Even the officer's hand shook as he held the freezer lid. "What was that?" Auntie Joy asked, her voice strained, eyes wide. "What's inside?" The officer didn't respond. The room was silent for a heartbeat. And then, slowly, he opened the freezer. Auntie Joy's eyes widened, her breath caught in her chest as the lid creaked open. The room held its breath as the thick, oppressive air seemed to pull us all into a trance. But I couldn't look away. None of us could. Auntie Joy took a step closer, her hand shaking as she reached for the freezer. The officer tried to stop her, but he couldn't. It was as if her presence alone made him freeze, too. The freezer's contents were hidden under a layer of frost, but the coldness in the room seemed to increase as the lid opened further. And that's when we heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible sound. A scratching. Something, or someone, trying to get out. Auntie Joy took another step forward, her eyes locked on the freezer. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "Please. No. No, no, no." The officer made one last desperate attempt to close the freezer, but it was too late. The door was wide open now, and the silence was broken by what we all saw next. Auntie Joy's hand shook violently as she reached out, her fingers grazing the edge of the freezer door. The room felt as though it had stopped moving, like we were all caught in some terrible dream, too scared to wake up. Another scratch, louder this time. And then a breath so deep and guttural it sent a wave of panic through everyone in the room. Shut it now! One of the officers barked, his voice trembling, but it was too late. Auntie Joy, despite the officer's orders, yanked the freezer door open completely. And what we saw inside, I can't even put it into words. There's nothing in this world that can prepare you for the sight of what we found. The bodies weren't frozen. They were covered in frost, their skin pale, stiff, and bruised from what looked like hours of struggle. Mira, Abuka, and Samto, the 3 children, lay there, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. Their bodies, twisted and contorted in unnatural positions, were a sickening sight that made my stomach turn. But it was the eyes, their wide, unblinking eyes, that I'll never forget. They stared at us, but it was like they weren't really seeing us at all. They were empty, hollow. The air in the room became so thick with dread it felt suffocating. I thought I was going to collapse. Auntie Joy collapsed to her knees, her screams a primal gut-wrenching sound that echoed through the house. "My babies! My babies!" she cried over and over, her voice breaking. She reached out toward them, but the officers quickly grabbed her, pulling her away from the freezer. "No! Let me go!" she screamed, fighting them off with every ounce of strength she had left. Her eyes were wild, unfocused. One of the officers, trembling, placed a hand on her shoulder. "Ma'am, we can't let you do that. We need to process the scene." But Auntie Joy wasn't hearing anything. Her mind had shut down. It was like she couldn't comprehend what she was seeing. She kept saying their names as if doing so would somehow bring them back to life. The other tenants in the compound had gathered outside the door by now, their faces pale, expressions a mix of horror and disbelief. Word had spread fast, too fast. Everyone knew what had happened, but no one could wrap their minds around it. The children, Auntie Joy's children, were dead. The scene felt unreal, like something out of a nightmare. But it wasn't. It was real. I don't know how long we stood there, just staring at those frozen bodies, each of us lost in our own thoughts, haunted by the same question: how? How could this have happened? The police began taking photos, making notes, and talking in hushed tones. They were trying to keep their composure, but I could see the fear in their eyes, too. They didn't know what to make of this. No one did. Then something strange happened. One of the officers, he was the one who had been the most nervous throughout this whole ordeal, pulled me aside. "Listen," he said in a low voice, his eyes darting around to make sure no one else was listening. "There's something off about this. We can't explain it yet, but there's something they're not telling us. Something's not right." I didn't know what to make of it. "What do you mean?" He looked around again, and then leaned closer. "When we found them, their bodies were cold, frozen, but the freezer, it wasn't on. It wasn't plugged in. It was just sitting there." I froze. What he was saying didn't make sense. The fridge was shaking earlier. Something had to have been inside it, right? But if the freezer wasn't on, how did they end up there? The officer shook his head. "Something's not adding up. This isn't natural. And I don't know who or what could have done this, but we're going to find out." But I didn't care about what the officer was saying. I couldn't focus on anything else but the horrifying image of those 3 innocent children, their bodies frozen in time, never to move or speak again. As the hours wore on, the scene became more chaotic. The officers continued to process the house, but every one of us, every single person there, couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It felt like we were all being watched, like we weren't alone in that house. The neighbors were whispering among themselves. They said it was the work of a spirit, a curse. Some even claimed it was a punishment from the gods for something Auntie Joy had done. But I didn't believe in that. I couldn't. This wasn't the work of some god or spirit. It was something far more evil. And I could feel it. Whatever it wasn't finished yet. They told Auntie Joy to stay away from the scene, but she refused. She stayed there, eyes locked on her children, screaming for them to wake up, and I couldn't stop thinking, what had happened to them? How had they ended up like this? As the night stretched on, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't safe. The whispers of the neighbors, the look in the officer's eyes, everything was just wrong. I wanted to scream too, but my throat felt tight. My body was numb. The police rushed to Auntie Joy, trying to comfort her, but no words could make any sense of this. We didn't know who had done this. We didn't know how or why. But we all stood there, frozen, unable to move, as Auntie Joy's heart-wrenching cries filled the air. To this day, we haven't found out who did it. But every time I close my eyes, I still hear that scream. The scream of a mother who lost everything. And I still don't understand how they got into that fridge.